Qiyi 8x8 and 9x9. So I'll just talk about a few general stuff that I like first. Firstly, both of them are glossy, which I do enjoy it better than the Mei Long, which is frosted, although the MF is also glossy. The size is a bit bigger than both the MF and the Mei Long. Those two will come at 69 for the 8x8 and 74 for the 9x9, but the Qiyi series comes at 70 for the 8x8 and 75 for the 9x9, or all dimensions in millimeters. For the shades, I'm not really a fan of it. The green, yellow, and orange are basically the same shades that you'll find on most Qiyi flagship cubes, such as the Spark or the Vault 5. But the colors that I'm really not a fan of are the red and blue. I know this is still part of the standard scheme for this particular series with this packaging, but I much prefer a more pure red rather than a purplish red, although still better than having pink on your cubes. Also not a fan of the pale blue. I do like the darker blue a bit better. The plastic itself has a really smooth feel, but you can feel the pieces crunching slightly, which I think is a feel that's really comparable to what the MF series have to offer, although I would say the Mei Long series feels slightly sandier due to the cubes being frosted. Now to specific features of each cube, starting with the 8x8. I feel that the Qiyi 8x8 is actually really fast. It's comparable to the Tiansheng 8x8 and it's faster than both Mei Long and MF. And the cube also has a soft feel, not that the plastic is soft. I do think it's a hard plastic cube, but like when I say soft, it does have some flexibility to its feel, and that's really what I mean by soft. A lot of this has to do with mechanism, which I will mention later. One minor thing about the Qiyi 8x8 that annoys me is actually how square it is. Pieces are significantly much more square than the MF8, and even comparing with the Mei Long 10, like the Mei Long 10 overall has rounder internal pieces compared to the Qiyi. And I'm not too sure where the Mei Long 8 lies on this spectrum, but based on an old photo that I found on my own Instagram, the Mei Long is at least close to the MF8s in terms of how round it is. So this basically lands the Qiyi as the most square cube on the spectrum, and it actually can get annoying because like the cube tends to catch quite a lot more. I feel that this is actually made worse by the flexibility of the cube, but I feel that this is an issue that magnets can resolve. And I'm not saying that the Qiyi 8 is bad. I do actually like how this cube feels, and I do think it has a lot of potential, but it's just easier to talk about the catching because it's an abnormal event, so every time it happens I notice it. Whereas things like the superior speed as well as the overall better flexibility that allows nicer outer layer turning, like they're simply there all the time and they streamline your soft, and they're just normal events, so when they happen I don't really notice them as much as like compared to a catch. My conclusion for the 8x8 is that it needs magnets, and for non-speed cubing purposes I think it's okay to just use this 8x8 because it has a really low turning effort. So if you're not bothered by the catches and you just don't want to be tired out by a cube that needs so much force to turn, I think this is one of the better options out there. But for speed cubing purposes, however, I do think having an increased flexibility together with a squared design on the same cube makes it difficult for me to solve it fast, and I actually find it hard to get times that actually beat the non-magnetic Mei Long 8. However, if you intend to magnetize the Qiyi, I do think a magnetic Qiyi is actually better than a magnetic Mei Long because like for the speed and the flexibility reasons, and I do feel that magnets do help an unstable cube more than a stable cube, and I personally also think that the Mei Long is quite overly stable, and so is the MF. Magnets don't really help with the stability of those two, they just help with layer alignment. But for the Qiyi cube, however, you get to boost both the layer alignment and stability together, and I do think the result can be quite nice. For the 9x9, I don't even like this cube at all. I think it's really slow and it pops a lot. It does get a lot of deforming lockups. It's actually not a very enjoyable cube to solve on. The speed does increase with break-in, and I would say that the outer layers at least are comparable with what my MF8 is post-spring swap. So overall, I do think the speed is better than what the MF series has to offer. But assuming no spring swap is done to any cube mentioned, the MF9 would be faster than the MF8, while the Qiyi 9 is slower than the Qiyi 8s. And I can't remember exactly where the MF9 lies on the spectrum, so it might just meet in the middle together with the Qiyi 9, although just based on what I've heard online, I do think that like Qiyi 9 is faster, although that's based on what I heard from other people. It's not for my own personal, like comparing the two cubes side by side. Also never tried the Mei Long 9, so I do not know where that cube lies on the spectrum, whether the springs in it are good or not. But the Qiyi 9x9 is like one of those cubes where I feel that the optimum way to set up this cube is just to either spring swap or spring compress it and try to make it as similar to the Qiyi 8x8 as possible in your setup. Then after that, just magnetize it. The reason for that is the mechanism is just the same thing as the 8x8s, and the only form of variation that can kind of occur is the spring strength, and I do think that the 9x9 springs are just too strong. It's because of the strong springs where I actually think that this cube is too loose, so it allows the cube to flex a lot more, in fact more than the anti-popping capabilities of the cube itself, which allows for all those pops and deforming lockups. At the same time, because the spring is so strong, it exerts a lot of force on the face, so it gives an overall tight and slow feeding, and it makes the cube more stable than the 8x8s. So if the springs have been weaker, I do think that I can tighten the cube much more without compromising the speed, and that would help to reduce the pops and the deforming lockups. But that's pretty much the same description I have about the MF series. So overall, I do think I'm quite disappointed in the Qiyi 9x9. I find that it's not really that good of a cube, and I know of a way to make it good, and it's messing with the spring strength, which is borderline modding. And it's something I'm willing to do in 2018 if there's only one option of cube to go with, and all the competition comes from cubes that are way too big to properly hold in your hands. In that case, I do feel that like even if the smaller cube doesn't turn as nicely as the bigger cube, it's still worth it to modify the smaller cube to make its turning catch up in terms of standard. But in the era where there are multiple 69mm 8x8s and multiple 74mm 9x9s, I do think that the Qiyi would have a harder time trying to stand out with like with a feature that's really special. Because like, when this came out, the special feature was the size. But then for this one, there isn't really that many special features that I can talk about. At most, it's just the speed, but even then, it's just slightly faster. And I still think this cube is slow on its own. And in terms of like preventing pops and deforming lockups, well, I got a lot of them on this cube. You need to set it up the same way I set up this cube. Whereas for the 8x8, I at least get to skip the spring swap step and just hit straight to magnetization. The two cubes have identical mechanisms, except for the fact that the 8x8 hides the inner layer. But if you were to look carefully at the roots, the 9x9 pieces do have slightly bigger roots than the 8x8s, so they're not 100% interchangeable. So from this point on, I'm just going to refer to all three series of Mei Long, Qiyi, and MF as 9x9s because the 8x8s are structurally the same. And so the most major difference between the Qiyi mechanism apart from the Mei Long and MF mechanisms is that the Qiyi mechanisms have two shells containing a 5x5 inside a 9x9. The Mei Long and MF have three shells which are a 3x3 inside a 5x5 inside a 9x9. So here's a shot of the Qiyi 9x9 to show how pieces of that internal 5x5 shell can be assembled without the need for pieces of the outer 9x9 shell. I actually wholeheartedly agree with Qiyi's decision to omit the innermost 3x3 shell. In fact, you can actually dig out all my old designs for the Light S6, 7 and 8 if I haven't deleted the videos yet. And like they have internal 5x5 shells without the internal 3x3 shell. And what I feel about the internal 3x3 shell is that it locks down the outer layer of the Mei Long and the MF cubes, making them way more stable than the Qiyi cubes. And I personally think this is an overkill because it makes the outer layers super stiff and it also slows down the outers. And in fact, my spring swap MF8 has a second, third and fourth layer that turns way faster than the Qiyi 9x9 second, third and fourth layer. But the outer layer is just comparable in speed to the Qiyi 9x9. Having a 5x5 internal shell without the 3x3 internal shell is precisely why the Qiyi 8x8 feels so nice. The outer layer just flows a lot better than a 3 shell cube with the internal 3x3 and the 5x5 together. And it also turns just faster with less effort. And yet the second layer is sufficiently held down by the inner 5x5 shell, and it doesn't feel as flimsy as a mechanism with only one single 9x9 shell on the outside. In addition to shells, there's also variation in the amount of anchors. The original MF8 and 9 have 2 anchors located in the 3x3 and 5x5 shells respectively, which leaves the outer 9x9 shell to be made of entirely out straight lines with no anti-pop defense. The Mei Long 8 and 9 have 3 anchors, so the first two are the same as the MF8 and 9, but the third anchor is in the outer 9x9 shell, and this helps to contort the outer shell pieces to have a more hook-like shape. as explained in my Meilong 8 versus MF8 video. So the Qiyi 8 and 9 also only have 2 anchors. The second anchor is where the difference is made. So it's much bigger than the MF and Meilong anchors. So it ascends out of the 5x5 shell into the outer 9x9, allowing it to take some of the function of the Meilong's outermost third anchor. And additionally, the second layer of the Qiyi mechanism has one extra hook that goes under the third layer, but it's located slightly outside the 5x5 shell, and this also helps to extend the hook shape of the small centerpieces much more and make them even harder to pop, which worked very well for the 8x8, but the 9x9 could have used a weaker spring and be tensioned more tightly. So in conclusion, I'd rather just wait for the Tiansheng 8 and 9 to be officially released. But if you like bigger sized cubes, or if you want a DIY setup, or if you just want a more flexible 8x8, then maybe you can consider the Qiyi 8x8s. And for non-speed cubers, if you just want a cube that takes very little effort to turn and you don't mind the catching because you don't really care about the time, then you can also just take the Qiyi 8x8 in non-magnetic form. For the 9x9, I don't really have a reason to recommend this. Maybe if you don't have a Meilong and MF9 at all, it might be worth it. But if you already have one of those cubes, I think spring compressing that old cube and magnetizing it and tensioning it a lot tighter, which is basically the same setup I described for the Qiyi 9x9. Like doing the whole setup is just better than buying a totally new cube that needs that setup to be done anyway. My opinion of the 8x8 hardware scene is that it bears some degree of resemblance to the 6x6 hardware scene, but delayed by about maybe 2 or 3 years. The original Shengshu 8x8 is like the Shengshu 6x6. This is just the base pair of cubes that I'm going to compare everything else to. So the Yixing Huanglong 8x8 is a bit like the Moyi Aoshi 6x6. They're both bigger than the respective Shengshu cubes that I've talked about earlier. And they both have a softer feeling, they corner cut better, and overall just perform better. Then the MF8 is like the Yixing Red 6x6. It's a lot smaller than all of the previous models, much nicer to hold in the hand, but it's quite a bad cube out of the box considering it's really slow. It either pops or deforms really easily, but it can be made good with a spring swap. Once the spring swap is done, you're left with a cube that is so much smaller, more stable than the other cubes on the market, and much more friendly to speed cubes. The Meilong 8x8 would be like the Aoshi GTS. The Aoshi GTS is a cube that's mostly similar to the Red, while the Meilong 8 is mostly similar to the MF, but it skips the need to spring swap. And even if you count spring swap, the Meilong 8x8 is still faster than the MF8, and the Aoshi GTS is still faster than the Red. And overall, there's also less popping or deforming problems. However, one major difference is that the Meilong 8 is only available in non-magnetic form, while the Aoshi comes both factory magnetized and non-magnetic. And on the same scale, the Tiansheng 8x8 would be the MGC6. Both of these are just really fast, really nice cubes. This one has the most potential in its performance. And where the Qiyi 8x8 lies on the spectrum would be the Shadow V2, minus the magnets, because the Shadow V2 is factory magnetic, while the Qiyi 8x8 doesn't come with magnets. So both of these are softer and more flexible cubes than most of the other models. And I do think these two cubes are kind of at risk of getting overshadowed by the Tiansheng 8x8 and the MGC6.